Early January 1945, Dwight D. Eisenhower was facing the most dangerous command crisis of the war. Not because of German tanks, not because of collapsing fronts, but because the alliance holding the Western world together was starting to tear itself apart. Only weeks earlier, Allied forces had survived the Battle of the Bulge, the largest German counteroffensive of the war. American soldiers had frozen in the Ardennes. They had fought surrounded, outnumbered, and short of ammunition. Nearly 19,000 never came home. The front held. The Germans failed. But the victory came with a price Eisenhower had not expected. At a press conference in early January, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stepped before reporters and rewrote the story of the battle. He described how he had arrived to find American forces in confusion, how he had taken control, how British leadership had restored order and stopped the Germans. It sounded less like coordination and more like rescue, less like partnership and more like indictment. Within hours, the reaction was explosive. American newspapers accused Montgomery of stealing credit. Veterans organizations demanded explanations. Officers across the front seethed in private. To men who had survived the Ardennes, Montgomery's words felt like a second attack. This time from their own side. They had not panicked. They had endured. And now a British commander was dismissing their sacrifice as chaos rescued by superior leadership. Inside Allied headquarters, the damage was immediate. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American 12th Army Group, delivered a message to Eisenhower that carried enormous weight. If Montgomery remained in a position of authority over American armies, Bradley would resign. He would not serve under a system that allowed American soldiers to be publicly humiliated. This was not personal pride. It was command legitimacy. George Patton made his position clear soon after. If Bradley resigned, Patton would follow. Patton's Third Army had turned 90 degrees in a blizzard and driven north to save Bastogne. His men had broken the German advance from the south. American blood had paid the price for victory. Patton would not accept that sacrifice being subordinated to British ego. Suddenly, Eisenhower was staring at a nightmare scenario. The resignation of America's most senior field commanders. A collapse of the Allied command structure. A war effort fractured not by enemy action, but by internal politics. Eisenhower had been chosen as supreme commander because he could balance alliances. Now that skill was being tested to its limit. He could not afford to lose Bradley and Patton, but he also could not afford to publicly humiliate Montgomery. Montgomery was not just a general. He was Britain's most visible battlefield symbol. Firing him outright would send a shockwave through London. It would suggest that American power now dictated Allied leadership unilaterally. Winston Churchill feared exactly that. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower drafted contingency orders. Montgomery was hours away from being relieved. What stopped it was not diplomacy. It was warning. Montgomery's own chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Guignand, flew to Eisenhower's headquarters and saw the reality for himself. The alliance was on the edge. De Guignand returned to Montgomery and delivered a blunt assessment. Apologize, or be fired. Montgomery complied. On January 8th, he issued a public apology. Not because he believed he was wrong, but because he had been told his career was finished if he didn't. The apology prevented his dismissal. It did nothing to repair trust. American commanders accepted it as damage control, not sincerity. The crisis did not end. It evolved, because Montgomery was not finished. During the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower had made a temporary decision under extreme pressure. Two American armies, the 1st and the 9th, had been placed under Montgomery's operational control. More than 500,000 American soldiers. The reason had been practical. The German offensive had split the American front. Montgomery's headquarters sat closer to the northern sector. Coordination demanded speed. Everyone understood the arrangement was temporary. Everyone, except Montgomery. To him, the Bulge was proof. Proof that when Americans were pushed to the brink, British command was essential. His press conference may have angered allies, but the message behind it remained. Now he wanted to formalize that power. Permanent control of two American armies. Not for crisis management, but for the final drive into Germany. When Eisenhower looked at the maps in early January, he wasn't just weighing military options. He was carrying the weight of an alliance fraying at the seams. Between volcanic American fury and unyielding British insistence. This was not a decision with a clean solution. If he gave Montgomery what he wanted, he would lose his American commanders. If he denied him outright, he risked shattering the alliance. Eisenhower needed an answer that satisfied no one, but kept everyone in the war. And Montgomery was about to test how far he could push. The apology had stopped Montgomery's removal. It had not stopped his ambition. Only days after diffusing one crisis, Eisenhower found himself facing another, more dangerous than the first. Because this time, Montgomery wasn't talking to reporters. He was talking directly to Supreme Command. During the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower had made a decision driven by emergency, not doctrine. The German offensive had shattered the American front in the Ardennes. Communications were broken. Units were scattered. Time mattered more than pride. So Eisenhower placed two American armies under Montgomery's operational control. The U.S. First Army, the U.S. Ninth Army. Together, more than 500,000 American soldiers. The arrangement was always meant to be temporary. Once the crisis passed, command would return to normal. Montgomery never saw it that way. To him, the Bulge was confirmation. When Americans were threatened, British command provided stability. British planning brought order. British leadership saved the situation. His press conference had said it clumsily. Now he would say it formally. Montgomery arrived at Supreme Headquarters with a plan already prepared. It was bold. It was simple. And it required American armies to make it work. The war, Montgomery argued, was being fought incorrectly. The broad front advance was wasting manpower and time. Allied strength was being diluted across too many axes. Progress in the South was slow. Resources were stretched thin. Victory required concentration. One decisive blow. A massive northern thrust straight into Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr. But British and Canadian forces alone were no longer sufficient. After 5 years of war, they were exhausted. Casualties had thinned units. Replacements were limited. The Empire no longer had endless manpower. American strength was the key. Montgomery told Eisenhower plainly, if he was to deliver victory, he needed the First and Ninth Armies permanently under his command. Without them, the Northern offensive would fail. He framed it as military logic. But beneath the language of strategy lay something else. Control. Montgomery was not asking for cooperation. He was asking for authority. Eisenhower listened without interruption. He understood Montgomery's argument. Concentration of force had merit. The Ruhr was a legitimate objective. Montgomery's planning was thorough, methodical, and carefully structured. But Eisenhower also understood the cost. These were not British armies. They were American formations commanded by American generals who had fought from Normandy across France. General Omar Bradley had commanded these forces since D-Day. He had bled with them. He had built their trust. Stripping them away permanently would not just offend Bradley. It would break him. Bradley had already been clay. If Montgomery retained permanent command of American armies, Bradley would not accept his position. He would not serve as an army group commander without armies to command. He would not watch American soldiers be used to pursue British strategic objectives while British commanders claimed the credit. Eisenhower could not ignore that. George Patton's position was even more volatile. Patton had turned his army in the dead of winter to save Bastogne. His forces had slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive. He believed American aggression and speed, not British caution, had stopped the Bulge from becoming disaster. For Patton, Montgomery's demand was the final insult. If Bradley resigned, Patton would resign with him. This was no empty threat. Losing both men would detonate the American command structure. Eisenhower faced a brutal truth. He could keep Montgomery satisfied, or he could keep the American generals loyal. He could not do both. When Montgomery finished his presentation, Eisenhower responded simply. The command arrangement had been temporary. The armies would return to American control. Montgomery's reaction was immediate. Cold. Controlled. To him, Eisenhower was making a military mistake to avoid political discomfort. He believed history would prove him right. But Eisenhower was not finished. Behind the scenes, Winston Churchill was already aware of the danger. He understood what was at stake. If Montgomery lost all American forces, British influence over Allied strategy would collapse. The final victory in Europe would be shaped entirely by American command and American methods. Churchill proposed a compromise. Montgomery would keep one American army, the Ninth Army. The First Army would return to Bradley. This would preserve British relevance while preventing an American revolt. Eisenhower accepted the framework, but added a condition Churchill had not specified. Montgomery would keep the Ninth Army only for a single operation, the Rhine crossing. After that, the army would return to American command. No extensions, no reinterpretation. One army, one mission. When Eisenhower delivered the terms in person, Montgomery understood what was being offered. This was not negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Accept the reduction, or lose both armies immediately. Montgomery protested. Long-term planning required stable command structures. Removing the army after the Rhine would disrupt operations. Victory required continuity. Eisenhower repeated the decision. Final. Montgomery faced a choice. Accept humiliation, or command only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. He accepted, not because he agreed, but because refusal meant defeat, without a single shot fired. The crisis was temporarily contained, but the trust that once held the alliance together was gone, and Eisenhower knew the real test was still ahead. Montgomery accepted Eisenhower's terms, but acceptance did not mean surrender. As January turned into February, the alliance appeared stable on the surface. The command crisis had been contained. The press had moved on. Orders had been issued. Yet beneath the paperwork, distrust hardened. Montgomery retained operational control of the U.S. Ninth Army, temporarily, for one purpose, the crossing of the Rhine. To Eisenhower, this was a calculated risk, a controlled experiment. Montgomery would be given one last chance to demonstrate that his methodical, centralized style could justify the authority he demanded. To Montgomery, it was something else, an opening. The Rhine was the final great natural barrier into Germany. Whoever controlled its crossing would shape the final campaign. If Montgomery could prove that his plan required continued unity of command, he believed Eisenhower would have no choice but to extend his authority. Planning began immediately. Montgomery prepared Operation Plunder as the largest deliberate river crossing of the war. Nothing would be left to improvisation. Artillery concentrations were calculated to the minute. Engineers rehearsed bridge construction under simulated fire. 2 airborne divisions were assigned to land behind German lines and seize key crossings. At the heart of the operation stood the Ninth Army. General William Simpson's forces would form the southern arm of the assault. American infantry, armor, and engineers would carry much of the fighting. Simpson was a professional. He respected Montgomery's organizational skill. The planning was meticulous, every contingency addressed. For officers accustomed to rapid American-style exploitation, it felt slow, but undeniably thorough. Yet something began to unsettle Ninth Army staff officers. Montgomery's planners spoke openly about operations beyond the Rhine. Advance routes into northern Germany were mapped out. Supply lines extended eastward. Future objectives were assigned. In every plan, the Ninth Army remained under the 21st Army Group. No one spoke of returning it to Bradley. The temporary nature of the command seemed to be evaporating. Eisenhower noticed. He chose not to intervene. For now. Then, from the south, George Patton moved. On March 22, 1945, elements of Third Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. German defenses in the sector were thin. The river was wide, but vulnerable. Patton did not wait. Without massive artillery preparation, without airborne drops, without elaborate rehearsals, he attacked. Within hours, American troops were across the Rhine. Engineers threw bridges under fire. Infantry secured footholds. Armor followed. Patton immediately called Bradley. His message was precise. Tell the world we're across. This was more than a tactical success. It was a challenge. Patton had demonstrated that the Rhine, the barrier Montgomery had treated as an immovable obstacle, could be breached through speed and aggression. Montgomery was furious. To him, this was reckless luck, an undisciplined gamble that could have ended in disaster. The Rhine required proper preparation, overwhelming force, and careful timing. Operation Plunder would prove that. On March 23rd, the operation launched. Over 300,000 Allied troops surged forward. Massive artillery barrages lit the night sky. Airborne divisions descended behind German lines. Engineers worked under fire, assembling bridges as shells burst around them. The Ninth Army attacked from the south. British and Canadian forces advanced from the north. The assault succeeded. German resistance was heavy, but Allied power was overwhelming. By March 25th, a deep bridgehead had been established. The last natural barrier into Germany had fallen. Montgomery declared the operation a model of perfection, a triumph of planning and coordination. Yet the comparison lingered. Patton had crossed first, with fewer resources, with less preparation, with greater speed. American newspapers noticed. So did Eisenhower. After the crossing, Montgomery pressed his case. Removing the Ninth Army now, he argued, would be militarily irresponsible. Operations were already in motion. Unity of command was essential to encircle German forces in the Ruhr. Transferring the army at this stage would disrupt momentum. Once again, operational necessity was being used as leverage. Bradley saw exactly what was happening. This was the pattern he had warned Eisenhower about. Every operation would justify another delay. Every delay would create another dependency. Montgomery was turning a temporary arrangement into permanent control. Eisenhower understood the irony. Months earlier, Patton had been denied fuel to support Montgomery's failed Market Garden offensive, and Operation Montgomery had declared 90% successful despite its collapse. Now Montgomery was again attempting to redirect American strength to serve his vision. Eisenhower did not respond immediately. He waited. He let Montgomery reveal his intentions fully. The Rhine had been crossed. The condition had been met. The gamble was over, and Eisenhower now had the justification he needed. The Rhine had been crossed. The condition Eisenhower had set was fulfilled. Now came the moment that would decide who truly commanded the final phase of the war in Europe. Montgomery moved quickly. Within days of Operation Plunder, his headquarters circulated operational plans for the advance into northern Germany. The documents assumed continuity. Routes, objectives, and supply lines all included the U.S. Ninth Army as a permanent component of the 21st Army Group. There was no mention of returning the Army to American command. To Montgomery, this was not defiance. It was inevitability. He argued that withdrawing the Ninth Army now would fracture an operation already in motion. The encirclement of German forces in the Ruhr demanded unity of command. Any change, he warned, would slow the advance and risk unnecessary casualties. It was the same argument, refined. Operational necessity had become a shield. Eisenhower recognized the tactic immediately. This was exactly what Bradley had predicted. Every successful operation would become justification for extending Montgomery's authority. If Eisenhower yielded now, there would never be a clean moment to reclaim the army. The war would end with American forces completing British plans under British command. Bradley delivered his final warning. Montgomery had crossed the Rhine. He had been given his chance. Now the promise had to be honored. Eisenhower agreed. On April 4, 1945, the order was issued. The U.S. Ninth Army would return to the 12th Army Group. The transfer was immediate. It was final. General William Simpson now reported to Bradley. Montgomery's command over American forces ended that day. Montgomery protested. He appealed to Winston Churchill, arguing that the decision crippled his advance into northern Germany. The Ninth Army, he insisted, had been essential to every operation since the Rhine crossing. Removing it now made no military sense. Churchill did not intervene. The political cost was too high. Britain's influence over Allied strategy had been eroding since Normandy. The balance of power was no longer equal. Fighting this battle would expose that reality too openly. This decision was a quiet admission of what had already become true. American forces would be commanded by Americans. The precedent was restored. The Ninth Army continued its advance east under Bradley's direction. In late April, American troops linked up with Soviet forces along the Elbe River, sealing Germany's fate. The army Montgomery had fought to keep played its final role in victory. Without him, Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced with British and Canadian forces alone. They liberated the Netherlands. They secured northern German ports. They accepted the surrender of German forces in their sector on May 4, 1945. But Montgomery was no longer shaping the war's direction. His vision of a massive northern thrust to Berlin had died months earlier, not in combat, but in controversy. Eisenhower's compromise had achieved its purpose. The alliance survived, but the consequences were unmistakable. By granting Montgomery temporary command of the Ninth Army, Eisenhower had exposed the limits of Montgomery's approach. Even with American strength, Montgomery's methodical pace could not match American operational speed. Patton crossed the Rhine first. American armies advanced faster. The final drive into Germany belonged to American doctrine. Montgomery had been given one last opportunity to justify his authority. Instead, he tried to extend it. And in doing so, he lost everything he sought to preserve. The lesson was clear. Coalition warfare depends on trust. Montgomery destroyed that trust, not on the battlefield, but at a podium. His press conference had turned allies into adversaries. His ambition had turned cooperation into competition. Eisenhower had given him enough rope. Montgomery used every inch. In the end, Bernard Montgomery did not lose command because of German resistance. He lost it because he placed ego above alliance. And in a war fought by coalitions, that was the one mistake no commander could survive.